Good evening. Wow, is that how it goes if you're faculty? Good evening. Thank you, Brenda. I am Joni Mahoney, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as president here at SUNY ESF, and I thank all of you for joining us this evening for the 2024 Dal Travis Lecture featuring Dr. Jonathan Cohen. As we begin this evening's event, I'd like to acknowledge where we stand. We have the privilege of gathering today in the ancestral lands of the Onondaga Nation, the center of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who we honor for their many contributions, including the original philosophy and practice of environmental stewardship. The Dal Travis Lecture Series was established in 2012 to help the greater community learn about the incredible work and research happening here at ESF. Featuring the college's world-class faculty and renowned field experts, these lectures demonstrate how our faculty push the boundaries of knowledge and research in their academic specialties. We are pleased to be joined tonight by our lecturers' founders and sponsors, Dal Travis and Sigrid Freundorfer. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our friends and ESF graduate, Dal Travis and Sigrid. It's truly been a pleasure having Dal back here as an ESF alum, and we've had the opportunity to become friends, and I know your passion and support for ESF in many different ways. This is just one, but one very important one, and we're really grateful that you give us the opportunity to highlight our wonderful faculty, so thank you very much. Our speaker tonight is Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management, Jonathan Cohen. And before I tell you about him, I also want to welcome his department chair, Steve Teal, who has joined us. Thank you, Steve. And Jonathan's wife, who we just met at dinner. And I have the pleasure of introducing a fellow Joni, Joan Gallagher. It's a pleasure to have both of you here with us tonight, too. Dr. Cohen's research aims to understand factors that limit population growth of wild species of conservation concern and to help better manage and care for this part of our natural heritage. Jonathan works with his students and colleagues to develop quantitative tools for the analysis of wild populations. He works closely with wildlife management agencies and conservation organizations to translate his research into action, including the co-authoring of management plans, the implementation of habitat restoration, and the development of web-based decision support tools. Dr. Cohen has worked on conservation issues for threatened and endangered birds and mammals in coastal and forest ecosystems, as well as species that are hunted. Jonathan has shared his findings in research articles, monographs, and book chapters. Jonathan and his graduate students have presented their findings at scientific venues around the world, including leading a workshop on shorebird research and conservation in the state of Gujarat, India. He teaches the senior capstone class on management of wildlife habitat and populations and several graduate-level courses on quantitative methods for wildlife research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Cohen to our stage.
Thank you, President Mahoney, and it's my pleasure to be talking to you today about the species that I've spent a huge part of my career working on. Excuse me for a second. So I saw my first piping plover in 1995. I was an ornithological intern, so my job was to work with birds, and then on my day off, I went bird watching, and that's when I saw the piping plover. It was Cape May, New Jersey. Didn't realize I was looking destiny in the face at that time. And a couple of years later, in 1998, I finished my master's, and before I began my real job in the fall, I decided to blow off some steam. So I was a plover monitor in Duxbury, Massachusetts, for Mass Audubon, and that's where I really fell in love with the species, and I learned a lot about them. And so a couple years later, in 2000, I was in a good position to apply for and then accept a PhD position at Virginia Tech that was going to be looking at conservation and biology of piping plovers on Long Island, New York. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that work a little bit later tonight. I want to also acknowledge some of my previous students who had helped a lot putting these slides together for various presentations in the past, so give them some credit for putting some of these slides together that I'm going to show tonight, and I'll reference some of their work too. Before I continue, I also want to acknowledge the indigenous people who are the original stewards of the Great Lakes and coastal dune systems I'm going to be talking about tonight in Long Island and the Great Lakes, and specifically tonight to point out that they live sustainably with the piping plover for generations, and that's a hopeful thought because it means we can learn to do that too. And many of them are today partners in various recovery efforts for the species. Okay, so introducing our main character for tonight. This is the piping plover. It is a creature of the beach. It nests on the beach, it rests on the beach, it feeds on the beach. When it migrates south for the winter, it goes to the beach, and it even looks like the beach. It gets its name from its little call, which is a little piping sound that people often describe as peepalo. Let me see if I can get the bird to introduce itself to you here, if this will work. Is this pretty high? So when I was working on them after a few years of my PhD, I would hear them in grocery stores and everywhere I was going, just every night. So this is an adult plover, and you can see, as I mentioned, they look like the beach. So their back is sand-colored, and that's so that predators that are above them, they're about the size of your fist, and they run around on the ground. So at that size, almost everything is above them. So from above, they don't want to be visible. And also when they're sitting on their nests. And so as for their nests, here's one right here. They lay 4 eggs, and their nest is really just a little depression they scrape in the sand, so they don't work too hard at that part of it. Sometimes if they're feeling jaunty, they'll line it with little bits of shell or pebble, but sometimes they don't. And again, the eggs are colored like the beach so that predators can't see them. And so it takes them 6 days. They lay the eggs every other day, and then the eggs hatch 28 days later, so 34 days total. And when the young hatch, they look like this, extraordinarily cute and also colored like the beach. And that's because when danger comes, they flatten down on the ground and crouch and hope that nobody can see them. So camouflage is what this bird's all about. And the chicks, they have a big job ahead of them. They have to grow enough and be able to fly in 25 days after they hatch. They're precocial, so like chickens, they follow the parents to the feeding areas and they feed themselves. And the parents keep them safe by giving them alarms when there's danger, and when they're young and can't thermoregulate properly, they brood them under their wings. So camouflage and then distraction. So if you happen to come up to a nest on purpose or by accident, then the parents are very good at this broken wing display. So they'll come up often right up to your toes and flap a wing as if it's broken. And they'll start to walk away. And if you're a good person and you want to make them feel good about themselves, you'll follow them slowly as they walk away. And after you get a certain distance away and they feel comfortable, they'll jump up in the air and laugh at you and then fly back to their nest. So where do they live? So there's a couple ways to answer that. So first, in the big picture, there are 3 distinct breeding populations in North America. So this is strictly a North American species. And so those are the northern Great Plains, the Great Lakes, and the Atlantic coasts. And I'm going to talk tonight about Atlantic coast and Great Lakes plovers. So in the Atlantic coast, they live on beaches from Prince Edward Island down to the outer banks of North Carolina. In the Great Lakes, they live on the beaches on the different lakes. And then in the northern Great Plains, it's the one place they're not strictly on beaches. They will nest on beaches around some of the bigger lakes in the Great Plains, but they also nest on sandbars in the bigger rivers and also on the margins of little prairie potholes. These are little wetlands that dot the Great Plains from northern United States up to southern Canada. Okay, so why are we talking about them? Why do we care? So first of all, I care about them because I consider them a unique part of our natural heritage in the United States. So they are strictly North American, and on top of that, they're one of very few species that lives and nests on beaches. So they really are a unique part of that ecosystem, and plovers on the beach means that it's a healthy and thriving ecosystem. Officially, we also care about them because they're protected by law. So what happened was by the 1980s, all of these 3 populations had reached critically low numbers, and we'll talk about why in a minute. So in the Atlantic coast, so under the Endangered Species Act, you officially put a species on the list and then it gets protected. So on the Atlantic coast, there were 790 pairs left by 1986, and at that time the species was listed as, that population was listed as threatened. So you can list different populations of the same species depending on the different factors. The Great Lakes was critically endangered, so in 1986 there was only 12 pairs left in the entire Great Lakes area. So they were listed as endangered. And so we say pairs because the species is monogamous for breeding season. So the males arrive first from the winter, and they pick a territory that looks good to them. and then the females come after that, and the males do little displays, and then the females pick a male that looks good to them, but also making sure the territory looks good. And so, and then those two will stay together for the rest of the summer. And they're also very faithful to the site that they nest in. So quite often they'll come back year after year and nest, sometimes within just a few yards of where they nested last year. And because the male and the female both do this, even though they don't migrate together, they don't spend the winter together, often you'll see the same male and female nest together for 3 or even 5 years in a row. So we count pairs because of that. In the Great Plains, though, it's such a big area, and it's very hard to survey all these little wetlands, so they don't have time to go and monitor and figure out who's paired with who, so they just count the individuals. And so they counted a little over 2,900 individuals in 1991, and that might seem like a lot, but remember we're talking about Nebraska up to Saskatchewan, so it's a huge area, so these birds are pretty sparsely distributed through there. Threatened is an official term under the Endangered Species Act, and it means that without action, they expect the species to decline until it's endangered, and endangered specifically means that without action, they will become extinct in the near future. And so, obviously, we then, under the Endangered Species Act, once a species is listed, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service works on what's called a recovery plan, which will contain goals to grow the population, as well as what the threats are and how and what we can, what are the strategies to try to reverse the trends. Okay, so the other aspect of where they live is sort of what kind of neighborhood do they pick. And so, as I mentioned, they like beaches. This is an area in the Great Lakes. They really like what we call barrier islands, so very narrow islands on barrier spits also, so sometimes only a couple hundred yards across. And that's because the plovers like to nest near moist areas where they feed on insects and crustaceans and worms and that kind of thing. So, so think of this: the higher elevation sandy areas are kind of the bedroom for the plovers, and the wet areas are kind of like the kitchen. And just like you and me, they like those to be as close together as possible. So that's going to attract them. And here's a close-up of an area in the Atlantic coast. So I mentioned that they're camouflaged. So imagine you're standing on a sand dune looking out. This gray band here is the ocean. So there's little dunes right here. And try as you might, you won't notice, but there's a nest right there. So they really like to be out in the open where they can see danger coming. So they can, if a predator comes along, they can jump off the nest and give their alarm call and start leading the predator away from their young. They will also nest in sparse vegetation like this, but anything really dense, they won't be able to use. Here's an area. This is Sandy Island Beach State Park, close by here, an hour north of us. And you can see this is an area where they have been nesting for the past few years. I'm going to talk about it more later, but again, we have this open sandy area next to the wet area. They really like inlets, which are breaks in a barrier island where water comes in and out. We like them too, because that's where we get our boats in and out. But there's a lot of, these are very productive areas, so you get a lot of food for plovers that are in the wet areas on these inlets where water's washing in and out all the time. And so this is actually at this site where they nested up on this little pile of sand here, which was placed there by humans, and the plovers liked it. And also, disturbance is a very important factor in creating habitat for them. So you can see this is Fire Island, and this is some of the consequences of Hurricane Sandy. These big washes of sand, which go from here's the Atlantic Ocean across into the salt marsh. So all this reddish stuff is salt marsh. And then you have South Bay over here, which is shallower water, low wave energy. And then this is a breach, so the storm actually punctured a hole through the island there. So lots of bedroom next to lots of kitchen, and so this area was very attractive to plovers. And so over the course of evolutionary history, the plovers evolved to take advantage of these big disturbances. They'll colonize them fast and grow, and do well there for a while until vegetative succession takes over, and then they have to find a new place. And throughout history, there's always a new storm. So why did they decline? So originally, many of you may know in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that was the era of market hunting. In the United States, people would shoot at birds in large numbers. That's when we lost the passenger pigeon, originally the most abundant land bird in North America in the mid-1800s, and only 2 left by 1914. And people would throw dynamite into the huge flocks, and then the meat would go to market. For shorebirds, they would take the feathers and give them to hat industries for decoration. And all that ended with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. And But as the plovers and other birds began to recover from that era, people in the 1950s was kind of known as the era of recreation. So people began to realize how much they liked going to the beach for fun. They would build houses there, and you can see that. So there's a lot of, and they would also try to armor the shoreline to prevent erosion. So all this, a lot of human bedrooms and not much plover bedroom here anymore. So loss of that habitat. And that amount of area they did have was, often saw huge numbers of people for recreation. So no bedroom at all here for a bird during this part of the season. So this was the major reason why they declined. And then with people comes increased predator communities. So people go to the beach, and when they leave, they've left their French fries and whatever else lying around, and that attracts foxes and crows and raccoons and things, and all of those, and gulls, all of those things will eat plover eggs, plover chicks, and some of them plover adults. And of course, people also sometimes let their cats or dogs roam around on the beach, and those also are threats. So a lot was going against this bird. A little bird nesting on the ground where it's really vulnerable to predators. And so we know that human disturbance has subtle effects also. This is from work that my student Michelle Stanchel did. So this is looking at the growth rate of plovers. So when they have access to good foraging habitat, the chick growth is faster, and they can actually fly sooner than 25 days. So here we have a little brood, and there's no disturbance on this beach. It's a barrier island, so you've got this ocean side, and when the tide is up, they can still go over to this bay side and feed. They go back and forth all day long, and they grow really fast, and they can fly soon. Over here, there might be food along the ocean side, but there's people. The chicks are hiding back in the grass. There is food in the grass, like insects, but it's not nearly the same density. So it can take them more than 25 days to grow, and the problem is the longer it takes them to grow, the longer it takes them to fly, and the longer they're vulnerable to predators. And so what have we done to help the bird? So there's a few strategies that were in the recovery plan that have been implemented throughout both the Atlantic coast and the Great Lakes. Excuse me. So the first one is symbolic fencing. And this is, it's symbolic because it's just string that goes between posts and the sand. They put some flags there so people will see it, but you could easily go under it, or if you're feeling lucky, try to jump over it. There's nothing, it's not really a barrier. And on every few poles, there's a sign telling people what's inside and why they're not supposed to go in there. And so this is really just creating some bedroom for them. So these are beaches where there's still going to be lots of people, but we just want to give them space where they can nest. And when I say if you build it, they will come, this really works. So places where they hadn't seen plovers for a while because of all the disturbance, they put the string up, and the birds start showing up pretty fast. They don't understand the string, so they'll nest outside of it, which is annoying, but then people will come and extend the rope around so they're protected. So when there's lots of people, they'll be walking all along outside here, and the plovers will be here waiting for a chance to go down to the water later, probably. Another huge important part of the recovery strategy are these nest exclosures. So this is literally a cage. It's a wire cage put over the nest with a soft bird net roof. And so plovers, they are birds, so they can fly, but as shorebirds, they run around a lot. So they can run in and out of this thing without a problem, and their eggs will be right here in the center. And predators can't get in. So here you see a fox walking around trying to find a way to get in there. Couple of birds inside talking to each other over their nest. And this is a great benefit in terms of getting eggs to hatch. So it's one of the most important things that people have done. Unfortunately, once the chicks hatch, as I mentioned, they start walking around, they leave the cage almost immediately, and then they're vulnerable again. And also, unfortunately, sometimes predators learn what this thing is. They know there's food. And so foxes might jump over and try to crash through the top or dig under. Some birds of prey just wait outside for the adults to come out and pounce on them. And so when that happens, you can't use them anymore at that site. And then the biggest one is monitoring. So this is just literally people watching the birds, watching over them. And up and down the coast of the Atlantic and the Great Lakes, there's dozens of people every year that are doing this. So they're looking for the nests. When they find the nest, they check on them every so often. They put up the exclosures. They do enforcement, like making sure people keep dogs on the leash. And after the nests hatch, they come back and try to find the little broods. And so we know where they're feeding, so we can protect them better. So it turns out, if you're just mindful and pay attention to the birds, then you can help them to really thrive. So just by knowing where they are and what they're doing. And this has also been a gateway for lots of young people to enter conservation. So there's countless people have become conservation biologists or wildlife biologists, got their start as a piping plover monitor on the Atlantic coast or the Great Lakes. In fact, it's kind of a cottage industry, and there was a paper published in 2002, and at that time they showed that an average of $3 million were spent in the Atlantic coast every year for plover conservation. So that's the investment that it took. Did it work? Yes, it did. So here we have the abundance of piping plovers on the Atlantic coast from the time they were listed until 2021, and since that time I can tell you the trend has continued. And so over 2,000 pairs, and it was mostly these three basic things: the symbolic fencing, nest exclosures, and lots of monitoring. In fact, one of the goals in the recovery plan for the Atlantic coast population was that we would achieve 2,000 pairs. So they crossed that in 2021. There's a second part of that, though, that they haven't met yet. So those 2,000 pairs were supposed to be distributed throughout the range from Canada down to Virginia. And in fact, most of the recovery has been New York, which is doing awesome, North and New England. So most of them are in Massachusetts and places like Maine. Whereas New Jersey has been struggling to grow, sort of keeping steady all this time, and south of there, populations have started to decline. And that's an area of active research, whether it's predators or we've seen models. So Piping Plover World has gotten together with Sea Level Rise World and made some models of plover habitat, and it seems like projected over the next 50 years, like south of New York, the habitat's going to disappear faster than New York and northward. So maybe there's some effects of that already happening. So I want to talk now about some research, some of the stuff that I did for my PhD that first sort of shed light on some of the things I already showed you. So what do pullovers like, and what's the role of storms? So this is where I did my work in West Hampton Dunes, New York. This is the island right here in the Hamptons, kind of east central Long Island. And my story begins with a storm. So I don't know if any of you are from Long Island. You may know the legend of the hurricane of 1938. I asked my class, I told this part of the story to my class a couple weeks ago, and even those from Long Island had never heard of it, so I guess it faded from memory. But it was huge, one of the biggest natural disasters of the 20th century. The storm came from Africa and then went straight up the Atlantic in a beeline for New York at 60 miles an hour, and by the time it got there, it was Category 5. So it just smashed into the coast, and people didn't really get out of the way because a couple things. Back then, there wasn't much communication like there is now. They just got some communication from ships at sea, and also people literally believed that hurricanes could not come that far north. So when they heard it, they didn't believe it. And so I read a book about it, and even like the waves started getting huge, and the people on the coast were like, "Oh, cool," but they got salt spray in Vermont and New Hampshire from this monster, and it erased all trace of humanity from this part of Long Island. So you can see here. There was a guy who was studying piping plovers at the time in that area. He was watching the recovery after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the plovers were growing slowly, and he noted in his paper that after the hurricane went through, it just exploded. The plovers were suddenly increasing like crazy everywhere, and that's, well, you can see just tons of new habitat they were responding to. So that was our first indication that storms were an important part of this story. And then in the 1950s, people decided that would probably never happen again, and so they were going to build their houses back on the island, and bigger, better, and faster, and more. And here we have salt marsh turning into condos and houses, paved road. And to hedge their bets, they decided to reinforce the coast with rocks. In this case, these perpendicular rock structures, which are called groins. And so the way it works is sand flows with the longshore current from east to west, and these rock structures, these groins, would catch the sand, and that would make the beach get wider, so make people feel like more comfortable that if another storm came, they'd have a buffer. But unfortunately, the Army Corps of Engineers that was building these ran out of money right there. And so what was going on was the sand was getting trapped to the east, and people to the west, the sand in front of their house was getting starved. And so fast forward to the 1990s, you can see these are mostly little fishing cabanas perched on the brink of destruction. There's that last groin. There were no piping plovers as of 1984 because the habitat was gone. And the nor'easter in 92 came and punched a hole right through there, washed away all the houses. And immediately that following spring, 5 pairs said, all right. Under an emergency state law, the Army Corps filled in this breach with sand, and there was no reconstruction of homes yet. So the Plovers also are like, all right, more sand, and the population almost tripled in 1 year after that. So again, a storm created. So the storm also deposited these mud flats that were intertidal, so they had a lot of food. So there's the kitchen and more kitchen right next to the bedroom. Meanwhile, the people who used to live there were very upset, and they sued the Army Corps. And they won. And so the judge said that the Corps had to build a dune, basically a 6-foot-tall sand wall going along the whole length of here to try to protect it from future storms. And every 3 to 5 years had to renourish it, which is another term for beach fill, or pumping offshore sand onto the beach to widen it. Again, to create a buffer. But the judge said, well, you've got an endangered species now, so guess what? You've got to take care of it and be mindful of this thing and don't endanger it while you're doing your redevelopment of this area. And the man who became my advisor, Jim Frazier, happened to have a student working on plovers on Long Island at the time, and he got the contract from the Army Corps to start monitoring this site too, which was fateful for me. So as part of what I did for a monograph that we published, we used aerial photos to categorize changes to the habitat after the storm. So here's the area covered by human land use, the footprint of human land use. You can see after the storm, it went down a little. Those were little fishing cabanas. They were knocked down. After the breach repair, it took until 1996 before people started to feel comfortable that their homes would be safe in this place. The interim project means that's when they began renourishing, and then suddenly we had rebuilding in earnest, and they were not fishing cabanas anymore. So they were these really big houses sitting right next to each other. So where you've got these houses, you don't have plover habitat. Dense vegetation had covered the beach before the storm, and the storm really knocked it down. And so historically, this is how plover habitat was created. A place would grow with veg, storm would create a gap. But when people stabilize the beach, then the grass can grow back, and that's what started to happen and right here in the late 90s until it was almost back to what it was in the year 2000. So as I came in 2001, we had these houses being rebuilt. These are all places where plovers tried to nest all over that place. And by the year 2000, this was the densest population of piping plovers on the entire Atlantic coast. There were 40 pairs in 2 miles. And so here I show the actual amount of plover habitat in red bars and the plover population at this site in blue dots. So you can see after the storm, we got a lot more habitat because the vegetation, then the Army Corps threw a bunch more habitat into that breach, and the plovers responded really well. And then, depending on the year, some sand eroded, some sand accreted on the beach, and then they started renourishing, and then we started losing some to houses like this. And here's our peak of 40 pairs, and then they started to decline right as I got there in 2001. It wasn't my fault. Whose fault was it? So if we look look specifically at the amount of habitat on the bay side, right along the flats where the plovers like to feed, that's where the houses were going largely. So you can see right here we have the amount of habitat they could nest in right next to the mud flats, and here's the number of pairs that are nesting on that side only. And by 2000, it dropped off. So by 2004, there was almost no place left next to the kitchen and no plovers nesting there at all. And meanwhile, we were also looking at the quality of the habitat, of the foraging habitat. So classifying the intertidal zone on aerial photos, we saw that during all this time, the total area of the kitchen didn't change. So it was equally good the whole time. And we also used various methods to sample insects and worms and things, and we found the density of prey didn't change. So the quantity and quality was always good. But what happened was the birds couldn't get there anymore. So the blue dots show, so when we found plovers, we would watch them through binoculars and categorize their behavior and their habitat use in these 5-minute behavioral observations. And so what we saw is that when the pairs were on the bay side of the island, they were spending their time mostly on those flats feeding. So this is a plover brood, so 60 to 80% of their time they'd spend on the flats. But when we look at the red line, which is how much time are they actually on the bayside, it's dropping to 0 by 2004 because now they're forced to nest only along the ocean, and to get to the bay, they've got to walk over the dune, through the houses and the dense vegetation, and cross a road. So they stopped doing that. And so when you've separated the kitchen from the bedroom, suddenly the density drops off. Not as many birds are going to fight for a territory in that place. So another thing that we were interested in is because plovers that in these newly created storm areas, they also do very well usually with reproductive success. So we were curious about the effect of these disturbances on predator communities, and this is another study done in New Jersey by my PhD student, Michelle Stanchel. So much of New Jersey looks like this that you see here. Highly developed areas where there used to be dunes and marshes, densely vegetated dune, and plovers will nest in this strip of sand in a straight line. And there's some areas that are more pristine. So this is the Holgate unit of the Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge, and you can see some overwashes created by Hurricane Sandy, so big open areas there. And so she had a collection of sites that kind of spanned from this type of configuration to this. And so one thing that we know from the literature, not just from the beaches, but from other ecosystems, is that when you have ground nesting birds all forced nest in a straight line, predators, they can walk along a straight line and kind of pick them off as they go. So we were curious about how these storms affected occupancy of predators. And so Michelle, she would go out and do these plots where she counted predator tracks at different places along the beach, and we recorded also how far we were from these highly vegetated dune lines. And what she found was the further you got away from those highly vegetated dune lines, the less foxes would be present. So the predators themselves, they don't like to leave the shelter of the vegetation when they're hunting. And so not only do you create this nice attractive area near the food, but also you get some freedom from predators for a while. And in fact, this was something similar was shown by my colleagues at Virginia Tech. They were studying plovers on the sandbars in the Missouri River. And so there's another place. The Army Corps of Engineers, they control the flow of the river with hydroelectric dams. Historically, before the dams, in the spring, there'd be big floods that would flood the surrounding landscape, and when they receded, there was all these sandbars where the sand was deposited, and plovers would nest on those. But people who live along the river now, they don't like their land to be greatly flooded every spring, so the Army Corps stops that from happening by controlling the flows. But to make up for it, they tried to make some sandbars themselves by depositing sand and spreading it around. So you see one of those here, and the plovers were attracted to it, but the vegetation grew in pretty fast, and the predators found it, and then reproduction was basically impossible. And then just by coincidence, while Virginia Tech was out there, there was a flood that got away from the Army Corps one year. Just too fast and too high, and they had to let a lot of water through, and it recreated historical sandbar conditions. And the plovers spread out, and the predators, they also became scarce. And so we saw, again, there's a disturbance, created a lot of area for them to nest, and also gave them some years where they were free of predators before these were found. So very similar type of phenomenon. Okay, so what did we learn? So storms, they can create large areas of nesting and foraging habitat, and that plover density is greatest when the nesting habitat and the foraging areas are close together. So the bedroom and the kitchen close together. It's especially important that chicks are able to access high-quality foraging areas. The reason plovers want that is because without it, their chicks don't grow very quickly, and they're vulnerable to predation. And then, of course, having to cross back and forth across a road and dense vegetation is, also very dangerous. So, and then mammalian predators seem to be less common in overwashed areas far from dunes, at least soon after these disturbances happen. And was this news ever used? Yes, it was. So this is a slide from my colleagues, Todd Plover from the Conserve Wildlife Foundation of New Jersey and Brooke Maslow of Rutgers University, who spearheaded this project. So here again is a picture of coastal New Jersey, and as I mentioned, most of it is highly developed, so you see all this human development here and amusement parks and fenced-off areas with lots of people, and so difficult for plovers to make a living. And as I mentioned, New Jersey is one of those places where they've had difficulty getting the population to grow. So 1986, there was 100 pairs, and in 2015, there was a little over 100 pairs. And since that time, I can tell you it's stayed about the same, going up years, some years and down others. So they decided to see if they could create an area that was ideal based on what had been learned from my project and others on the coast that showed sort of similar things. They chose this area, which is Barnegat Light State Park. And it's a reinforced inlet area. This is a jetty, a rock jetty right here, that they use to make sure the inlet stays stable and doesn't erode, so boats can go in and out. Highly densely vegetated dune with woody vegetation. And every year they would get one pair of plovers nesting in there. And you can see this brown stuff is sort of water leaking through the jetty, which is the plovers like to feed there. There's insects there, but as soon as we get even a little bit into late morning, people are just coming by there so often that it's hard for the chicks to get down there and forage undisturbed. So they decided they were going to turn this area into a self-contained plover mecca. So they graded the area, they cleared all that woody vegetation, and then they contoured it to make little dunes here and there. And they also spread clamshell, so plovers are most comfortable when the surface of the sand has bits of shell and rock, because then their eggs are more hidden that way. So they did that. And then they lowered the elevation near the remaining dune to make a pond. So here you see they cleared 40 acres and graded 40 acres, and then they created a 5-acre pond. And this is what they were left with, and you've only been thinking about this for a few minutes, and you can already tell this is absolutely beautiful plover habitat. So open sandy areas, these little dunes that they can run in and out of, and there's the pond. And then this pond formed completely by accident. So they got lucky there, I guess. So what happened after that is the plover population increased from 1 to 6 pairs. So a huge return on their investment. The birds in most years were reproducing there well, so their productivity was above the federal goal. So productivity is how many chicks fledge per pair. And chicks that fledged there would return to breed in a following year at a really high rate, 80%, whereas the rest of New Jersey about 50%. So very successful habitat creation based on some of the findings from before. Okay, so I wanted to turn now to a more local story for us in the room, and that is the story of the Great Lakes. Historically, and here the accounts are somewhat sketchy, naturalist notebooks and so forth. They believe that there was about 500 to 800 pairs, so that's a pretty wide range. And they were spread throughout the entire Great Lakes system. So half of them were on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario historically. You can see in New York, not a huge, we're at the very edge of the range here, but 24 to 30 nesting pairs over here in New York. And extremely sadly, by the 1980s, this is what was left. All in Michigan, 12 pairs, and none on Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. Sometimes birds would pass through, and so the conservation that they started doing in 1986 was identical in a lot of ways to the Atlantic coast. So same strategies, symbolic fencing, nest exclosures, and lots of monitoring. But they did one thing in addition, because the population was so critically endangered. They started taking nests that seemed like they had been abandoned by the adults. Maybe one of the adults got killed by a predator. Maybe they were so disturbed they left and didn't come back. They'd bring them in captivity in the Detroit Zoo, hatch them in incubators, raise them, and then when they were almost ready to fly, they would bring them back to a beach and let them go. So it all happened within a single breeding season. And so here you can see they're almost fledged. They have this outdoor holding pen. They collect them up so you can see a view of the pen. And then they bring them into a box and then go back to the beach and let them go. Not always in the same beach they collected them from. Sometimes they bring them to a beach that they thought needed more plovers, hoping that they would sort of imprint on the area and come back next year, but always at a beach that had at least some plovers that could show them where to feed and what to do. And they had released 347 chicks from captivity since 1992, and in that time they tallied 2,615 chicks that grew up in the wild, so it's 13.3% of the total fledgling population came from this captive rearing program. So the question was, is this really contributing to the population? Are these birds going to survive the winter? So it seems like these strategies are, just like we saw on the Atlantic coast, pretty successful. So here's our 12 pairs to start with, and by 2021, we're passing 70 pairs. So exclosure use, the population still was kind of struggling, and they began captive rearing right there. But someone who did some research on the survival of these captive reared chicks from the mid-90s to the early 2000s, they found that their annual survival was quite low compared to chicks that would fledge in the wild. So if a chick was born in the wild, it had anywhere from a 30 to 60% chance of surviving the winter and coming back, whereas for these captive reared ones, only a 10 to 20% chance. So they might have been contributing to the population, but not as much as they would have liked. And around this time, they changed their strategy. They waited until the birds could fly quite well and put them out and hoped that that would increase their survival. And so this is where the study that I worked on came in. We were given data from 2015 to 2021 and asked to look at what is the contribution now of captive reared birds to the population. So we wanted to assess that, and we kind of hypothesized that their survival would improve because now they put them out when they can fly really well and they're less vulnerable, but still probably lower than wild reared birds. And so here is what we found. On here we've got adult and juveniles. So juveniles are basically a bird that's 1 year old. So they were released as fledglings, so they grew up in the wild as a fledgling, and now they're back to try to nest for the very first time. An adult is anything older than that, so 2-year-old bird or older. And so we looked at survival of each of these. And so we saw for females, so on this side of the graph we have the females, and the pink is captive reared birds, and the blue is wild reared birds. So what we saw is the captive reared birds for adult females, so these are birds that they've been out in the wild for a couple years, but they had their origin in a captive rearing facility. So by the time they're 2 years old, they're surviving just as well as a bird that grew up in the wild. And for the captive birds, they were now just a little bit less than the wild reared birds. So up to 30%, getting close to 40, so better than what we saw before when they were doing it a different way, getting much closer to the wild reared ones. Things got very strange when it came to the males. So let's look at the juveniles first. And what we see is 1-year-old males that were released from captivity had nearly adult survival levels. So they survived the winter really well, and they came back. They were really likely to come back. The wild-reared chicks, they have a much more normal, this is what we expect for the juveniles. So this is not something I can explain, but it's just something that we noticed. And then, even stranger, once they were 2 years old, they did terrible. So the older birds just... And so we're still not sure why, except we think maybe they come back and they try to nest and they're just not very good at life and they get killed maybe on the breeding grounds. It's just like a hypothesis right now. Because if that happens, then you won't see them obviously again the next year. So this is still something we're kind of looking into. And the wild reared males, they did survived about normally for a wild reared piping plover. Other studies have had survival of adult birds up to 80%, so this is still even a little bit low, actually, 70 to 75%. We also wanted to see, and this is the busiest figure I'll show you tonight, but I'll walk you through it. So we also wanted to see whether these captive reared birds were any good at raising young. And so part of that question is how well do their nests survive? And so here we have an even more complicated figure, but the juveniles, so the 1-year-olds, they're trying to nest for the very first time over here, and the 2-year-olds plus older are here. Those are the adults. On each panel, we have males on one side and females on the other. And then we also break it down to nests that had an exclosure and nests that don't, because if we don't include that, we're missing a huge factor that affects nest survival, because put those cages on, it greatly increases their chances of surviving. And that's just the first thing I'll show you. So these arrows point from an exclosed nest within that category to unexclosed nest, and it's always higher. So put the cages on, and here we see survival at over 75%. So this means that when they lay their eggs, there's a 75% chance or greater that at least one egg will hatch before the end of the season. Whereas here it's only 55%. And here, same for the males, over 75% if they're exclosed, 55% if they're not. You'd think they'd be kind of similar because they nest in pairs. And then for the juveniles, we thought they'd be pretty terrible at raising young, but the females did pretty well, actually. But the young males, not so well. And in fact, these are also the ones that are disappearing that following year and not surviving well. So whether these two things are related, still something we're looking at. But almost all the nests in the Great Lakes are exclosed, so most of them are going to be in this category. Very few aren't exclosed. Now, if we look just at the captive reared versus wild reared for females, so for the females who are, and this is also something we didn't really expect, but once they're 2 years old, they're not as good at raising young as the wild reared ones. 55% nest survival is actually still pretty good. Anything over 50% would be kind of happy with, because if they lose their eggs, they can try again at least once and even like 2, or sometimes if they lose them early, they can try 3 times more. So this is just the chance that an individual nest will die. So if it's 50-50, they lose it, they'll try again, and maybe they'll succeed next time. So this isn't too bad. We don't like to see 25%. With the juveniles, we saw that they did really well. So these young, I thought young birds were terrible at raising young, but these did really well. And the males, again, they did, both captive reared and wild reared males did great when their nests were exclosed. And the juveniles, they didn't do as well, but still pretty good, and the captive reared birds did fine. So we wanted to put all this information, the survival and the reproduction of wild and captive reared birds, into a population model and ask, what do we expect the population to be in 100 years from now if these conditions stayed the same, if we stopped releasing captive birds altogether, or what if we just kept doing it at the same rate that we're doing it now? So these are models that are pretty hot off the press, worked on by originally my student Allison Kosick and lately Molly Pasillo. And so here's what we see. So these graphs, these lines show you the projected number of birds 100 years from now if you stop doing the captive release, and you see that without it, the population will go extinct within 50 years or so. If you keep doing it, the population we project would still decline, but would stabilize. So this is good. Definitely not headed for extinction, lower than we would like, not headed towards the recovery goal, but at least gives us time to try and work on other strategies. But a lot of uncertainty around this line. So this gray area is literally a gray area. It shows sort of the actual projected population's 95% chance of being somewhere in between these two boundaries. And actually what's happened the last 3 years is the population's gone up a little. So it might be that, so we only had data until 2021, and they've been doing other stuff with predator management. So it might be that survival is better. We don't have access to that data yet, but in the future we'll add that to our model and see if we can get better survival estimates. But one thing seems for sure, without captive rearing, the population would be in huge trouble. So that strategy was really important in keeping them from declining to extinction. Survival of adult males was a little questionable, especially those that were reared in captivity and were 2 years old, so that's something we need to understand, and the contribution of that to our population models. And something we already knew, but saw again, nest exposure is really important for nest survival. All right, so lastly, I want to zoom in to our neighborhood, show what's really happening locally just in New York. Since we live in New York near the Great Lakes, thought it would be good to end on this. So historically, as I mentioned, and again, sort of sketchy accounts, but around 27 pairs nesting along the New York side of Lake Ontario. But they were more or less gone by 1955 when the habitat started to get lost. And then there was a sporadic nesting attempt in 1984, and that was the very last one. So, and everybody I knew, so when I moved up to ESF, everyone I knew from the Plover was quite sure we would never get plovers on Lake Ontario. The beaches are quite narrow and very developed and overrun with people. So it was an amazing surprise when one day in 2015 I got emails from people in the DEC and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service saying, we've got a pair at Lakeview Wildlife Management Area in Lake Ontario. So very exciting. Don't tell anyone, but we know from the leg bands that this pair was a brother and a sister. Wildlife, they do try to avoid that kind of shenanigans, but when a population is very small, sometimes things like this happen. But I'm happy to say that despite the inbreeding, the eggs were viable, and they hatched, and they've managed to fledge 2 young. And so from that point on, we wanted to start monitoring this. So here's the shoreline with potential plover habitat. So El Dorado Beach we've never seen birds checking that out yet, or Deer Creek Marsh, but these other 2 sites we've started to see the birds use. This is Lakeview Wildlife Management Area where they first recolonized, and this is Sandy Island Beach State Park. So there's 2015. They nested first on one end of this island. They lost that nest, and then they moved down, and their second nest is the one that actually hatched down at this end. And then the next year, we got a pair there and another pair here down in Sandy Island Beach nesting on that pile of sand that the people had put there. That sand was dredged up from like channel maintenance operations. They put them there, and as we see, plovers will use the habitat that people create for them. 2017, the lake levels were so high that there was just no habitat for plovers to nest. So we were very afraid that they would never find us again because it took so long the first time. But the water came down, and we got the Sandy Island Beach pair back on top of that pile next year. And then for the 3 years after that, it was the same male and female, and they were doing pretty well with fledging young. So we wanted to get to work, seeing how well we could maintain this foothold. So we wanted to determine factors that would limit nesting expansion in New York. We also wanted to determine best practices for maintaining and growing the population. So we've obviously learned a lot from the Atlantic coast, where I came from, and the rest of the Great Lakes, where a lot of my colleagues were working and publishing papers. But how could we apply them to this little area that we had, and determine whether we can contribute to the overall recovery? So can we produce young here that goes out and populates the other places in the lakes? So first, looking at factors limiting nesting expansion, one of my other students at the time, Maureen Durkin, she did a comparison of the habitat between the heart of Ploverdom in the Great Lakes, which is Michigan, and New York. And what she found was kind of what we expected. The habitat in New York is pretty terrible. So you can see in Michigan, 45% of the beaches in the potential plover nesting areas are 90 feet wide or more, and only a third in New York, and another third are only 5 to 30 feet wide, so quite narrow. That means that the sand is close to the tree line. Tree line is where things like hawks like to perch and foxes like to walk along. So tree line is scary. So there's that. As far as the substrate type, 96% of the beach in Michigan was sand, whereas here only 2/3, and a lot of it had been reinforced with rock, so obviously no plover's ever going to nest there. The primary type of land ownership was parks, so 75% of Michigan, whereas for us only 28%. Most of it's private and residential. And this just makes things a lot more difficult, especially because it's not like one big landowner, it's lots of parcels. So if you want to try to do something for plovers, you've got to have agreements with every single person, and some of them are on board and some of them don't like it because it's an endangered species. They think it might restrict what they can do. So obviously we're working at a disadvantage in New York in terms of the habitat. But the plovers were nesting anyways. And that's because they did such a good job in Michigan that the population was expanding and these young birds were just trying to find places to go. And some of them, lucky for us, were using areas that were not so great. So then we determining best practices for maintaining and growing the population. So soon after that colonization, we formed a working group of different partners. So in addition to ESF, the DEC, the state parks, Onondaga Audubon, originally Audubon New York also, which is part of National Audubon, was a partner, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So all of these groups working together, having meetings prior to the breeding season, coordinating throughout the breeding season on different activities, and then meeting afterwards to kind of debrief and doing all kinds of stuff together. So they put out cameras to look at the predator situation. There's a plover being chased by a fox. And the USDA would come and remove predators that were causing a problem. Lots of public education. The state park monitors putting out tables, talking to people, educating them about the plovers, because unlike the Atlantic coast, where by the time I got there, everyone was really used to what it means to have plovers on the beach. In this area, it was brand new. All these people could always come to the beach for decades and do whatever they wanted, and suddenly there's rope. So we tried to get out ahead of it with a lot of outreach to the public, Facebook page and flyers and all kinds of things, trying to make people feel that it was a good thing. Predator exclosures, so we put those up on nests. Advocacy, so trying to advocate for things like channel dredging to not occur when plovers were already on the site doing their nesting. And then law enforcement to try to make sure people aren't coming into the fenced areas, that they're keeping their dogs on leashes. So all our different partners working on all these different things. And then some habitat restoration. So this is something I was involved with working with the DEC on. So here's an area at Lakeview Wildlife Management Area. It was an old storm overwash that had become overgrown with herbaceous vegetation and trees. And so with the DEC, we cut the trees and removed a lot of the vegetation and cleared a lot of it out afterwards. That's site number 1 right here. And then site number 2 is at the inlet, and so some of the beach had become scarped, which means the sand forms a little cliff. So a plover chick jumps down, goes to the water to feed, and then it can't get back up. So we used rakes and graded it to make it smoother, and then also spread clamshell, just like in New Jersey, to make it more attractive, and roped it off. Then down at Sandy Island Beach, the Nature Conservancy was doing a beach widening project. It was motivated primarily to protect on the mainland in case this island was getting so thin they were afraid it was going to break through, and that could lead to more flooding here. But in addition, they were taking sand off of this shoal. So this is Sandy Island Beach State Park, which has a little bit of property here on the north side of this inlet. So they put some sand here too at the end in hopes that it might create some plover habitat. And then so now we wanted to see if they were actually using what we did, and they did. So in 2021, a new pair came and nested in the area that we worked on Lakeview. Unfortunately, after they laid 1 egg and a predator ate it right away, so that they didn't succeed. In 2022, though, another pair came to this site, and they did well. So they hatched 4 eggs, those 4 chicks, of them 2 fledged. When young people work on plovers, they like to name them. So in this case, they named the chicks after cheese. They always had a different theme all the time. Some surprisingly Generation X references for some of our young people. So we did fledge a couple from there, and down at Lakeview, we had a pair that nested in that area that the area that the Nature Conservancy had widened right there. And Aragon and Arwen, those are our Tolkien birds. They were the champs. These are the ones they were there from 2018 to 2023, always nesting together every year and doing pretty well most of those years. And then 2022, more pairs here. The same pairs actually, one year to the next. This year they fledged 3 chicks in this little place here on this that the people that had been made for them on the north side. As Aragorn and Arwen got older, they started doing less well at raising young, so only 1 fledged that year. So we were feeling really good about things for a while. Here's the population growth. So the recovery plan for the Great Lakes said that if we reached our carrying capacity in New York one day, we would have 3 pairs. And we got to 3 pairs. I was very proud, and I was sure we were going to punch through there, make some more habitat, maybe get 4 pairs someday. But unfortunately, what started to happen is what we had seen happen in other places. In 2023, predators, they actually killed 2 of the males. And so again, that's a big concern in a small population because, as I mentioned, what has to happen is the male has to find the place and take a territory, and then a female has to come along and decide she wants to be with him there. And having both of those things happen when we're far at the edge of the range with such a small population of only 80 in the whole Great Lakes, it's kind of rare. And in fact, this year in 2024, all we got was 1 pair. That was at Lakeview. So these pairs didn't get replaced after they lost their male. One of them was Aragorn, I'm sorry to say. And the female was killed by a predator right after she laid her eggs. So we're pretty concerned, and so it just means now we have to kind of reconsider. What do we do now? How can we maybe make some more habitat elsewhere, and what do we do to try to manage predators at this site? So we learned that plovers will come and absolutely nest in what looks like to us like pretty bad habitat, and they can do well there for a while. They will respond, as they did on the Atlantic coast, to human-created areas. And so productivity was good for several years, but as we saw in other places, predators are now maybe starting to overwhelm the population. But the working group isn't daunted. They're still making plans and trying to figure out what they're going to do to try to improve things in future years. So overall, the take-home, this is probably a 29-year-old myself holding a plover during my PhD years. Back on Long Island. So, there's a lot of hopeful news here because in both the Great Lakes and on the Atlantic coast, the populations grew a lot with a lot. So people were mindful and they were paying a lot of attention to the birds and they invested a lot in them. As I mentioned, the Atlantic coast, they put a dollar value on that in the early 2000s of $3 million a year. But the main thing is that a lot of people are paying attention to the birds and trying to give them some space for themselves. And it worked. It's, I think, one of the biggest success stories in wildlife conservation is how we went from populations that were near extinction to now we're feeling pretty secure about them. The problem is all the factors that threaten the species, they're still in full force. So people are still going to the beach in large numbers, they're still building, and the predators are all still there. And so we consider piping plovers to be what we call conservation reliant, which means they can persist and we can coexist with them, but we have to keep paying attention. So we have to keep doing all these things we've been doing in order to keep them from declining again. And so because of that, they can't be taken off the endangered species list. Species can't be taken off until they can survive without our help. That's just one of the criteria. And so this is, most of the species that are currently on our U.S. endangered species list are conservation reliant. And most of them are still facing all the same threats that they face. The ones that we've taken off the list had what seem now to be relatively simple problems, although they weren't that simple. We banned DDT, and it helped the peregrine falcon and the bald eagle because then their eggshell thinning got reversed. We banned hunting of alligators. We took them off the list because they recovered after that. But when it's habitat loss and disturbance, it's much more difficult. Those things are just always happening. And so some people kind of think of the Endangered Species Act as a failure because almost no species have been delisted, but neither have many of them gone extinct. So, and that's the main thing that the ESA was supposed to do. So it just shows that when they get protections, then they get people paying attention to them, and we can keep them persisting over time. And so from that point of view, I think the plovers are a poster child for the successes of the Endangered Species Act. All right, so you want to help. What can you do? So again, just be mindful. When you go to plover habitat, by all means, if you're one of those people who likes going to the beach, which I am one of them, it's one of my favorite places, probably where I would go whenever I could. If there's plover signs and there's plover nesting areas, walk along the water's edge and don't go up near the string where you might disturb birds off the nest. And by all means, enjoy watching them. They're a lot of fun to watch, so bring some binoculars, have the beach stewards point out where they are. And so, I spent so many hours watching plovers, of course, for my research, and I could tell a lot of stories, but just things that make you think. The one that stands out to me since I became a parent, I was watching a mother and a baby foraging along the ocean through binoculars when I was doing a PhD student, and so the little chick was just pecking at some seaweed, picking up little crustaceans or whatever, and then suddenly I saw through my binoculars, I saw the mother start to go crazy, and then I saw a jogger coming into view, so feet pounding, sand going up, and the mother starts piping alarms like crazy, and those of you who have children know that the chick didn't listen to her at all. So just get peck, whatever, and then I watched the mother run up behind the chick, peck it hard on the head and force it to the ground. You get down now. And there it stayed for quite a while. So they're just out there living their lives, and sometimes it's not that different from ours, and it's fun to watch. Keep your pets leashed. So dogs, I've watched dogs chase piping plovers with my own eyes. They will do it. No matter how good your dog is, it's really hard to resist that little bird running along on the sand. Remove trash and food when you leave, because they will attract raccoons, crows, gulls, foxes, possums, everything else that eats eggs. If you live near the beach, don't let your cats roam around. We know they'll attack adult birds. Some of my technicians found cats playing with plover eggs as if it was a little ball they were playing with. So, and then educate yourself. So read the signs, talk to the beach stewards, and learn about it. And I've got one more slide from Kennedy Sullivan, who coordinates the plover work up on Lake Ontario. If you really want to roll up your sleeves and get involved, she wants to invite you to become a steward. They can use monitors up there, monitoring the beaches, keeping their eye on nests, helping put up exclosures. If you're a student, you can get class credit and sometimes even work study for doing this kind of thing. So we can make a difference. And with that, I just want to thank the many people and organizations who have funded my work and who have been my partners and collaborators over the years, both in the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Coast. And while we're out there having our reception, I'll be really happy to talk to any of you and answer any questions. So thank you.
Thank you. One more round of applause for that fascinating and hopeful presentation. Thank you very much. And thank all of you for coming out tonight. There is a reception, a dessert reception, and you're all welcome to join us. And don't forget to stop by the table for your posters. And before we leave, I just want to give another thank you and round of applause to Dal Travis and his wife Sigrid, and thank you for making this event happen for us. All right, we'll see you outside.